Today my guest is Jay Wren. Jay, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. Let's talk about mono.
Okay.
What's mono?
Mono is an alternate implementation of ECMA 334 and 335.
Which are?
The C# and Common Intermediate Language specifications that Microsoft sent to the ECMA standards body.
Okay.
So you can think of it as everything that would entail, and it's also a whole bunch of other things. So I like to think of mono as sort of an umbrella for a whole bunch of really cool projects. It started off as those two things.
Okay, well, so C# is a language.
C# is a language.
It's compiled down to intermediate language, which
Yes.
is compiled to binary code. And this is, you say, an alternate implementation, meaning that, well, what do you do with that?
Well, it's open source, written by open source developers, funded largely by Novell now. But it basically means it's not Microsoft's .NET implementation.
So it compiles down to something else?
It compiles down to the same IL,
Okay.
that Common Intermediate Language, or the IL.
Okay, but it's another process that it gets to that IL.
Yep, they have their own
Microsoft didn't write
compiler.
the code
That's
to compile
right.
that.
Microsoft didn't write the compiler.
All right.
And then they have exactly what you said, then that gets converted in native code, right? So typically it's a jitter.
Okay.
The jitter turns that intermediate language into native code and runs. They have that as well. So instead of, and that's typically what we think of as the runtime, right?
All right.
So instead of Microsoft's runtime, there's this mono runtime.
Okay. So you said it was an umbrella of products. What is that umbrella?
Wow, what is the umbrella? That's big. So C# compiler and open source, both open source, but the runtime as well.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to execute .NET IL on pretty much any platform. So it runs on Windows, which kind of seems weird, but it does.
Yeah, it's not necessary since there's already a compiler for Windows.
Yeah, but you can actually use Mono's compiler and Mono's runtime. So this is really weird. But more importantly, it runs on Mac, it runs on Linux, it runs on most Unixes that you can think of. So FreeBSD, Solaris. It was interesting, in my previous career as a sysadmin, I had an IT system, I was administering a Solaris server, and I needed it to be able to talk to a Microsoft SQL Server database. And I don't know if anyone's ever administered a Solaris server, but our scripting environment was typically Perl or Python. This was the years before Ruby was very popular, but it was probably out there. And compiling a Perl or Python module that used C was very difficult, because typically the Perl that was on the Solaris box was compiled with a Sun compiler, but you have to buy a Sun compiler and it's usually not installed. And so a lot of this was difficult corporate enterprise Unix setups where the system's a little bit locked down. Anyway, lots of big pain there. It was very easy to just install Mono, and they have a SQL Server driver because it's just .NET. And I ended up writing my code in Visual Studio that would do what I needed, copy the exe over to Solaris and run it in Mono.
Oh, so there's a lot less friction to get Mono installed than getting all these proprietary compilers installed.
Definitely.
And for me, actually, being a C# developer by trade, I know that language so much better than I know any other language.
Yeah.
There's another barrier that if I'm working in Unix, it's going to be a lot slower for me to learn any other language, or write any other language.
Yep, so the cross-platform is big. It runs on iPhone. They've just announced that they're going to run on Android with the Monodroid project.
Okay.
It runs in some weird places too. I don't recall if they're targeting Wii just yet, but they are targeting, I believe, PlayStation. And the reason there is it makes a great scripting platform for games. So a lot of games use the Lua scripting engine, which has its own challenges. It's very light and tiny and small, and it does tend to run fast, but it is an interpreted scripting game engine. So the game designers will write their game engine in C or C++ and with all the GL stuff, but then when they need to script the stuff, they have to use something. And a lot of them use Lua, but it turns out that Mono, because it's JITted, is becoming more and more popular.
I don't follow. Why is that an advantage?
So it's JIT compiled, so that common intermediate language, that bytecode, is compiled as needed into a native code. So even on so the cell processors that are on PS3, it's compiled into that, as opposed to just the scripting language like Lua, where it's an interpreted scripting language.
Okay, so because it's brought down to binary code,
Yeah.
then it'll run faster. It'll
Yep.
It'll be optimized for that particular platform, basically.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. So that it's popular there, or getting more popular, I should say. But the real core of it is Linux targeted.
Okay.
And the reason for that is where it came from. Dates back to about 99 or 2000. I don't remember exactly which year, but if you remember a lot of what was going on in the computer industry then, Sun was suing Microsoft over their use of Java, or had just sued them. All of the industry trade magazines were obsessed with this concept of Linux on the desktop.
Okay.
And
Microsoft Java at that time was J#, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
they hadn't.
And they had their JVM, the Microsoft JVM,
Okay.
that they
I'm
shipped
trying
with
to-
Windows
I wasn't really
and
involved in that
Sun.
at that time.
Yeah, it was
C# sort of looked kind of like Java, but
eventually, yeah. Well, the lawsuit stemmed from Microsoft's JVM.
okay.
And Sun said, no, you can't do that. And Microsoft made some extensions to the Java language, which were awesome, by the way, but Sun said, no, you can't do that. And Java at the time was very closed, right? It was closely guarded intellectual property owned by Sun.
Mhm.
And if you tried to change it, you had to license it from Sun or something, you know? It was not the open source Java that we have today.
I see.
And more importantly than Java is this idea of Linux on the desktop. And Linux already had a really great word processor, really great spreadsheet, and these guys said, well, you know what's really missing is Outlook, right? We don't have good email and calendaring on the Linux desktop. So they said, we're going to make this. This was Nat Friedman, Miguel de Icaza. They started a couple of companies, what ultimately became Simian, which later on got bought by Novell. And they basically said, we're going to make an email calendaring application. They said, we're going to do it in 6 months. We're going to be as good or better than Outlook as 6 months so that we can replace Windows with Linux on the desktop. They ultimately failed. I mean, at least for the 6-month time frame, they definitely failed. It had gone a number of years, and it was very difficult, but they learned a lot. And one of the things that they learned was writing code in C is a big pain in the butt, and managing all that memory is a big pain in the butt, and they really wanted a managed environment. And I believe it was PDC 01, they saw C# and .NET for the first time. And they said, we need this, we're going to write our own implementation of this.
Okay, so they loved the language, but they didn't like Windows. They want that,
Right,
I want that
right.
language on my favorite operating system.
Exactly. They were a bunch of Linux guys. They went .NET on Linux.
Okay.
Really. And so they started working on it. And early on there, you know, it was very immature. And also, I didn't even know what Mono was back then. If you remember, at that time period, Microsoft had a horrible branding around this thing, .NET. They were confusing it
threw
with
that term out.
yeah, Windows
product.
Server .NET,
Yeah,
right?
BizTalk was
Which had
called
nothing to do with
.NET.
yeah, BizTalk.net. I mean, everything was .NET, and it wasn't really clear where it began and ended, right? And what we think of today as .NET, the runtime and the surrounding languages and libraries.
Right.
At least it wasn't clear to me, and maybe that's because I was off in Linux land myself.
No, I think
But-
they found a cool word. They decided to throw it on everything.
Yeah, it was a little
They
confusing.
pulled that back a little bit.
It was a little
So that is
confusing.
fine now.
So Mono kept developing their C# compiler over the years, and remember the goal was Linux on the desktop. So they already had a really great UI toolkit called GTK+, and kind of like in the Microsoft.NET world, how WinForms is really just a wrapper around some Win32 API tools, you know, and then a little bit more with more complex controls like the data grid and the data grid view. But ultimately, the text boxes and labels and the way we lay them out is pretty much a thin wrapper around Win32. They do the same thing, and they have a UI toolkit called GTK Sharp. And it got good enough over the years that, well, it got so good that a lot of the Linux distributions are shipping Mono out of the box with applications based on this. So right now, if you go download Ubuntu Linux, it comes with the little Stickies app called Tomboy, which is kind of a wiki Stickies hybrid, is written using this. And you'd never know it, it just happens to be out of the box Mono application running on Linux. Another one is their photo management tool, FSpot, which if you've ever used it, you know, wow, this is awesome. This is just like Windows Live Photo Gallery or iPhoto on a Mac, and in some ways a lot nicer than those tools. And, just beautiful UI, really nice widgets, seamless into the operating system and stuff. So those wins have been there for a couple years. So that speaks, I think, to the maturity of Mono today. They haven't really gone back and tackled the email thing, but I think that's because the world's changed a lot in 10 years, And so once Mono got mature enough that sort of the Windows people started looking at it, the first thing they or we wanted to do is take our WinForms app and run on it. Mm-hmm. And Mono didn't really have a lot of that implemented a few years ago, and now they really kind of do. So if you have a Windows Forms app that's pure Windows Forms, not a lot of third-party controls, or preferably none. I'm not sure how third-party controls work, but you can compile it in Visual Studio, take that exe, copy it to a Linux system, run it in Mono, and it pretty much works.
So you say run it in Mono? That's sort of different than the way I was perceiving Mono. I was sort of thinking of Mono as something that you develop in, and then you compile to. But you're saying that something can be developed elsewhere, developed in Visual Studio for .NET, compiled down to .NET executable.
That's right.
And then take that executable, and then somehow Mono would know how to run that on a Unix box.
That's right. So
it's more than just a compiler. Then that's sort of
it's the runtime as well.
Okay.
Yep. So at the beginning we said that it's ECMA 334 and 335, the compiler and the runtime, but the goal is to be more than just that. If they were just that, they would have been done a long time ago, but they wouldn't be fully compatible, because it turns out that there's nuances in the spec, in those ECMA specs isn't 100%, yes, absolutely, this is exactly what Microsoft is, right?
Right.
It's just like
a lot of latitude in how you're going to implement things.
Exactly. So the goal is 100% compatibility. So if Microsoft happens to deviate from the spec in certain places, Mono will create those same deviations and run.
Okay.
A few years ago, there were some places where Mono's C# compiler was a little bit more liberal with the IL that it generated, and Mono's runtime would run it just fine. But if you take that same executable and take it to Windows and try and let .NET run it, .NET would kind of say, no, this is not what we expected to see, and kind of blow up at you.
Aren't there also issues with there are capabilities of the different platforms? Not every operating system supports the same.
Well, if it's pure .NET code, then it's just IL, and it should just work.
Okay.
Now, as for the limitations of the platform, sure, some things are, you might p-invoke something, right?
Okay.
As soon as you p-invoke, all bets are off. You're doing a platform invoke. Yeah, you're not doing Windows stuff.
Okay. I was just thinking, are there low-level things? Is there anything related to printing in the framework or in the compiler? Is there anything related to video, or is that all handled by external libraries?
Pretty much handled by external libraries. I don't know, so video playback, there'd be like the WinForms media control or WPF media control.
So the language itself tries to stay away from that sort of thing.
Yeah, nothing too platform specific.
Okay.
So I just mentioned WPF, and I should mention that the official stance from Novell and the Mono project is WPF's too big. We're not going to do it. So there's no WPF.
But there is Silverlight.
Yeah, so there is Silverlight. You can do Silverlight. They call it the Moonlight project. So they have pretty good compatibility with everything 2.0, and they're working very hard to get 3.0 there, and Silverlight 4.0 now is coming as well. So they actually have some of the pieces in Silverlight 4.0 done, and other pieces aren't, even though not all 3.0 there. So it's in progress. And one of the popular things, or interesting things, I guess, is Silverlight on the desktop. Obviously, not just for the web.
Out of the browser.
Yeah, out of the browser experience. And I think the Moonlight team is very excited about that because that brings a whole new realm of richness to Linux desktop applications as well.
Yeah, if you did that, you wouldn't need WPF, would you?
Yeah, you don't need WPF at that point. WPF, of course, offers a whole bunch of things that Silverlight doesn't. 3D and other things that.
It offers some things, but I mean, it's not a ton of things.
Right.
I mean, as Silverlight becomes more and more powerful.
Right. So that's there. And while we're talking about things that aren't there, we should mention workflow is not there.
Okay.
There's some tiny pieces of it that have been community contributions, but nothing that Novell is funding.
Okay.
And the WCF profile is limited to pretty much what's in Silverlight. So really WCF's not all that there.
Okay.
But I should mention that the server side is there as well. So where they've done the client side of the WCF stuff for Silverlight, the server side stuff is there as well. So that's a lot of the new cutting edge stuff that's not there, but a lot of the stuff that's been around for a while is there. So ASMX, instead of WCF, before that we used to do ASMX. Web services, those are there. All of ASP.NET is there. ASP.NET MVC is there because that's actually open source.
Okay.
Microsoft gave that out with the MSPL. So ASP.NET MVC 2 is actually there already. Things like MEF, right? You're a MEF guy.
I played around with MEF.
Yeah, MEF is there. The managed
MEF addict, I
extensibility.
think, is the correct term.
Oh, yeah. So those mono guys are MEF addicts.
Yeah.
But that's there because for the same reason that it's open source. So there's a lot of really awesome things there.
Let's talk about the phone. You mentioned Silverlight out of the browser, and I immediately thought about the phone. Microsoft has a phone platform, and Google has the Android. You mentioned something about that earlier. And then there's the iPhone as well. There's some controversy around mono on the iPhone platform.
Yep. So let's start with the Android because that's a shorter story. They just announced it last week, I believe, or maybe even earlier this week, which is that it exists and that there's a public beta, or I guess it's a private beta that is open to the public. You can go sign up for it. They are doing the same thing that they did with the iPhone, and that is wrapping up the native UI widgets. So Android has its own UI toolkit. If you're familiar with mobile development, it's not the J2ME stuff. It's Android. It's their API and their UI toolkit. And so MonoDroid is wrapping that up, and that's how you can develop. So great C# language instead of Java, but native UI widgets, which really makes for a great experience for the end user. That's about all I know about the MonoDroid, to be honest.
Okay.
The iPhone thing, they have a product called MonoTouch, and that does the same thing. It wraps up Apple's native Cocoa Touch.
Yeah, you say we're talking about the open source community, or maybe.
Well, not open source
Or
actually.
no
A whole lot of MonoTouch is open source, but there are some pieces of it. In order to get it to run on your phone anyway, it's a commercial product.
So who owns that?
So Novell, yep.
Okay.
So you'd go buy it from Novell.
All right, but Apple has resisted
Apple
allowing this.
has announced that, well, they put in the terms of service of the Apple Software Development Kit license agreement that you will only develop using C or C++, or Objective-C using the Cocoa Touch toolkit or their UI toolkit or whatever. So basically, native Apple languages, native Apple UI toolkits. And you can't do MonoTouch with that. Now, that's only for getting things into the App Store. So if you're doing ad hoc deployment or enterprise deployment, you can continue to use MonoTouch. You aren't breaking the license agreement by doing so. The other thing there are, I believe it's 2 of the top 20 games in, at least at one point, in the App Store were written with Mono. So it's not like these are just small games. These are massively deployed. This is before they put the limit in. And I've yet to hear about any application being denied from the App Store for the reason being, well, you used MonoTouch. And there have been applications, I have heard of numerous applications accepted into the App Store using MonoTouch.
So they may not be enforcing it.
So yeah, they may not be enforcing it. A lot of the talk has been around, well, they're really targeting Adobe. It's a huge unknown, so we can't speculate.
Right.
What we can say is that for enterprise deployment, it's fine. There are over 200 games in the App Store that were built using a product called Unity 3D. And Unity leverages Mono. They bought a commercial license of Mono from Novell so that they could redistribute it in their games. And there's over 200 of these games in the App Store that aren't using Mono Touch, but they are using this Unity game engine.
Which is not Cocoa, it's not Apple
It's
Tools.
not Apple Tools, that's right, and it does have the Mono.
So technically
runtime.
that's not in compliance.
Technically, that's not in compliance. Yep, that's bits of code that were written using C# or using I believe they even have their own scripting, Unity script.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time. Tell me, if I want to get started in Mono, where's a good place for me to go to get started?
Go to go-mono.com. Also, should mention some great starting places are to just go download MonoDevelop. Even on Windows, MonoDevelop is a great alternative to Visual Studio Express.
Oh, it's an IDE.
It's an IDE, yep. And so if you run into if you've been using Visual Studio Express, but you've hit some limits there, right? And you're thinking, oh, I'm gonna go buy Pro, but you're not, if you're too poor or you can't afford it, you can't get your boss to buy it for you. I'd recommend your boss buying it for you, but if you can't, MonoDevelop's a pretty good alternative, has less of those limits.
Okay. And what if I want to learn more about Wren?
You can check out my blog at jrwren.renfam.com/blog or at JAYRWREN on Twitter. It's my name, middle initial, last name. That's pretty much how I go.
Excellent. All right, Jay, thanks a lot. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. That was a lot of information. I'm going to go back and absorb it.
All right. Mono helps me leverage technology with some of my friends.